All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are right now. Thank you so much for joining us for our inaugural Games History Hour. We are so excited to share with you an hour full of stories revolving around the IOC presidency. My name is Lindsay Flanagan-Hubin. I am the Chief Content and Integration Officer at the United States Olympic and Paralympic Museum, located in not very sunny today, Colorado Springs, Colorado. Our speakers today, it is my pleasure to introduce them. Richard Pound is an executive board member of the International Society of Olympic Historians and former president of the Canadian Olympic Committee. He was a member of the International Olympic Committee and served on the executive board for 18 years, including 2 terms as vice president. Richard was the founding president of the World Anti-Doping Agency and received the Olympic Order earlier this year. So congratulations again on that award, Richard. Philip Barker is a sports journalist, executive board member of the International Society of Olympic Historians, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Olympic History. He has covered every Olympic Games since 1996, was a torchbearer in London in 2012, and a historian to Team Great Britain. He also wrote The Story of the Olympic Torch and Lord's Firsts, A History of the Cricket Ground, which also staged the Olympic archery competition. So, Richard and Philip, it is my pleasure to be here with you this morning, and I'm ready to get started if you are.
Sure. Indeed, yeah, no, this should be fun. Congratulations on the idea of this kind of a
thank
series.
you. It was, yeah, we're so thrilled to be presenting this today. Well, our topic today is really the role of the IOC president, leadership, legacy, and the future. So I was wondering if you could start by telling us, either one of you, a little bit about sort of the responsibilities and expectations for an IOC president. What does that mean to be the president of the International Olympic Committee?
Well, it's certainly an evolving role. From the beginning of the IOC until 1980, when we had our first full-time president. It was a matter of trying to coordinate at a distance, and given the technology of the day, it was by written mail, and that was how you tried to keep track of all of the people all around the world and get them, getting the cats to march. Now it's a much more complicated organization that has all kinds of very able staff, which does a lot of the work that used to be done on the kitchen table, and it's now a boardroom table or a virtual table, kind of like we are this morning.
That's interesting. When we were chatting a little bit earlier this morning, Philip mentioned that there were some meetings that took place on a boat on the Nile. Is that correct, Philip?
Yeah, back in 1938, that was how they did it, on a cruise, a steamship down the Nile. I don't know whether you've ever been to an IOC meeting that was in an interesting location, Dick.
No, I mean probably the least interesting was Torino in 2006, when we were our headquarters were in the old Fiat production line, and it was interesting from that perspective, but not otherwise. It was and we were miles away from a lot of the action. So, but it's generally the facilities are pretty good, and in the places that we go, there are meeting rooms and so on that allow for both the session, which is with all the members and the staff, and now that they're open to the public, you have to be able to deal with several hundred people at the same time, and it's a much more logistical exercise than ever before.
Interesting.
When you look at the early ones, and there were not more than a dozen people at the IOC, what Dick says is absolutely true. I mean, even the president, the idea of electing a president has only been current for the last 100 years. When they started the Olympics, it was thought that the president should come from the country that was about to stage the Olympics. Now, it was the Athenian delegate to the IOC Congress, the International Olympic Committee Congress in the Sorbonne in 1894, who had pleaded the case for Athens to be awarded the Olympics in 1896, the first Olympics of the modern era. And then they decided, well, you be the president. And there's a letter from him to Baron Pierre de Coubertin, the French nobleman who was the driving force at one stage, saying, I can understand why presidents very soon resign, because the job was, the enormity of the responsibility that he had, even then, was upon him. And he had to actually convince the Greek government and the prime minister that they could afford the Olympics. There were ways of getting everything put in place, because the government at the time were quite anti it, because they said, we haven't got any money. And that's often a case. And so his first responsibility was actually to sweet talk the people in Greece into actually holding the Olympics the first time, Dimitrios Vikalis. And it was no surprise in 1896, as soon as the games were over, one of the minutes of the IOC meetings were next president and the next president, because the games were to be in Paris, in France, in 1900, was Baron Pierre de Coubertin himself. And so that idea was going on. And in fact, it was an American who stopped that notion of the rotation of the presidency, a man called William Milligan Sloan, who was a professor at Princeton, who'd got to know Baron Pierre de Coubertin because they ended up finding that they had a lot in common. He welcomed him to the United States when Coubertin went to find out about the Olympics. And he actually nominated Coubertin to continue, even though St. Louis were going to stage the 1904 Olympics. And by rights, it should have been an American president. So that's the first time that you had a non-native president leading the IOC at the time of the Olympics. Now, those early games were problematic for all kinds of reasons. Won't go into that right now, but they were teething things, and the IOC was still very much a niche organization then. And as Dick rightly said a few moments ago, since 1980, it's become almost like heading a multinational. But the difference being that you've got the Olympic mission, the idea of Olympism, and spreading the Olympic ideal as well, which most companies don't actually have.
That's fair. That's fair. I was taking notes while you were both talking, and now I I need to figure out what the next question is going to be. So you've already answered my next one, which was going to be, how has the role of the president changed over the last 30 years? So can you talk for a couple minutes instead, how are presidents selected today? So you've talked a little bit about how it happened in the very early years of the modern moment, but how does it happen now?
Well, it's pretty much the same as it always has been. It's the IOC members elect other members, and they elect the president, and now the executive board. In fact, the IOC members formally admit new members by a decision of the IOC session. So it's a kind of a closed democracy. But within the organization, it's very much a direct democracy.
So how does that work then when there's a crisis? How have past presidents handled crises within the Olympic movement or within the larger world that are impacting the games?
I think it kind of depends to some degree on the personality of the particular president. Recently we've had a very, very well organized president, very well informed and highly energetic, and he's able to shape the policy that needs to be adopted whenever something comes up. And if you take the pandemic, I thought Thomas Bach handled that very well, in the sense of keeping the balls in the air, especially for Tokyo, long enough for the Japanese to propose not just walking away from them, but postponing them for a year. And that had never happened before. And it's you can imagine it's kind of, the organizing committee has been in existence for 5 or 6 possibly 7 years. You're now coming. It's like a big plane. You're coming down. You can see the landing strip ahead of you, and somebody says, "Stop, hold it," for a year. And all of the arrangements that had to be put in place, and many being undone to be put back together again, were immensely complicated. And we were in a world that was actually shutting down. On a daily basis, it was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And there were only two options available to the president under the Olympic Charter: carry on with the games or cancel. There was not a charter mechanism to postpone. So that had to be invented on the fly. And it took a lot of, I think very few countries in the world could have handled a postponement the way the Japanese did.
I mean, they were lucky in that Thomas Bach is one of the in terms of actually facing the public and stuff. He's a personality, isn't he, who's comfortable in the spotlight. Whereas if you look back to, say, Lord Killannon, who was president in the 1970s, although he was a journalist, and even other presidents, that idea of being in front of the microphone, they didn't come across easily. I mean, even Avery Brundage, who was a big personality who gave lots of press conferences. He was president from 52 to 72. But when he stood in front of the microphone, he did not come across, when you see the film, of being a person at ease with that microphone, especially when he tried to speak in the language of the host nation, which was often excruciating to listen to. He'd learned these pat phrases, even in French, and it was like listening to a schoolboy reading his first verse, French, and it was painful to listen to. Same with Killannon to a certain extent. Juan Antonio Samaranch tried, it wasn't his first language, so to be fair to him, when he was president. But Bach has a facility in different languages, can switch from one to another in a very impressive fashion. And I'm sure that helped in many respects in garnering him a degree of respect as the face of the IOC when there's a crisis happening, because he can go into another language and immediately you start speaking somebody else's language. You end up getting a little bit of sympathy from them, don't you? You've built a bridge already. And I think that he was particularly good at that in his presidency, the way that he's been able to stand there and sound like and look like he may not have been at ease. I mean, during Tokyo, he actually admitted he had to have a poker face on for the preceding year, not to ever admit that there was a possibility that the games wouldn't happen. And although he had doubts, and you could see that you looked at the pictures of him during the Tokyo press conferences, he looked a worried man, but he never let on. He'd been a damn good poker player, I reckon.
So when it comes to making that sort of decision to carry on or to postpone or to cancel the games entirely, is that just the president that makes that decision? Is it the executive board, the organizing committee? How does something like that work?
Well, I think the executive board is led by the president, as is the IOC itself. So I think if that was not something he wanted to happen one way or another, it wouldn't have happened. And conversely, he said, no, we can postpone this. I've spoken to the Japanese. It'll be hard, but we can do it. And we'll the world needs some good news at this point in the middle of a pandemic. And not only the athletes who've prepared for this, but the world at large needed some good news in the middle of all of this. So, but he would then say to the executive board, here's our options. And my suggestion would be that we do the postponement route. And everybody, has a built-in interest in the movement and the games, and a responsibility to, the sport community at large that has been preparing for this. Let's find some way to make this happen. And postponing for a year is not the end of the world. And so that's how it evolved, and it was very successfully done, I must say. But that's will always be one of the highlights of his presidency.
So if that's one of the highlights of his presidency, can you speak on the highlights, one highlight from a different past president? I'll let you choose which president, but is there something else that really stands out in your mind as a highlight?
Well, I think that sort of the new version of the IOC really started with the election of Sam Ranch as president. He became the first full-time president. All the others lived at home and corresponded. He didn't have all of the technical stuff that we have, like this morning, and so it was a much more. If you look back in the days prior to that, it's kind of like some of the cave drawings that you find in old caves. Just you can't imagine that all of this came from that particular background. But so I think that's as Philip mentioned, Callanan was kind of a caretaker president. I think our cycle, if you analyze the presidents, you have a strong and forceful leader, like initially like de Coubertin, or like Avery Brundage in his day, and that's exhausting for the membership at large. So after Brundage, the obvious person probably was Count de Beaumont from France, but he was a very forceful personality. And the members sort of said, had enough of that. We've had 20 years of Brundage. Let's take a breather. And then Callanan, he only served one term. He ended up having some health problems. And then it was followed by Sam Ranch, who was a complete take charge person, knew all of the issues that were under discussion, knew where he wanted to go, had analyzed the problems of the boycotts that Callanan had to deal with. And it was a new team. And then after 20 some odd years of him, kind of another pause as Jacques Rogge took over for his 12 years, followed by the dynamic Thomas Bach. So it's a kind of an up and down rhythm that we have.
One of the things with IOC presidents is that, it's a bit like they used to say of generals, are you a lucky general? And there have been one or two that have been distinctly unlucky. If you look at Callanan, he had faced first off in 1972, not long after becoming president, with the fact that Denver and its residents, having been awarded the Winter Olympics in 1976, decided that they didn't fancy staging them for all kinds of reasons to do with the environment. And there was a referendum and the games had to be handed back. So first problem, he has to find a new host city for the 1976 Winter Olympics. He was lucky that Innsbruck came in. Then there were problems with Montreal for the 1976 Olympics, with construction, strikes, and so on and so forth. And then a boycott there because the New Zealand rugby team had played in South Africa, and a lot of African countries couldn't understand how they were able to keep contact in a sport that wasn't an Olympic sport at that time, or with South Africa in the apartheid regime. So there was a massive boycott there. There were other problems as well. And then, of course, the icing on the cake was Moscow, where countries boycotted the games because of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And some teams and the United States didn't go at all, neither did Canada or Germany, which is one of the reasons I think Thomas Bach was so opposed to any kind of boycott and exclusion of athletes. And so you had these two things. I mean, poor Callanan, I think he had a heart attack at one point during his presidency. And he looked, when he said at his closing speech, it was something like, I call upon the world to unite before a Holocaust descends. And these are quite striking words for an IOC president to be using at a closing ceremony of an Olympics. But he said that twice, both in the Lake Placid Winter Olympics of 1980 and at the Moscow Olympics. And he was an exhausted man when he left. And, you know, Samaranch had to deal with a boycott, but somehow the Los Angeles Games of 1984 were a success in spite of the boycott, the retaliatory boycott by the Soviet Union and its bloc. So he was therefore, inverted commas, a lucky general. And it went on from there. He had problems still to deal with, of course. 1988 and an attempt by the North Koreans to host some of the events, which was never a starter, but he showed his diplomatic skills by at least going through the motions. And various other. I mean, you've got to look at the Balkan War and how he dealt with that, and the whole. You know, so there were wars and problems throughout his area, but somehow he'd hit the lucky button and was you know, whatever he did actually didn't turn to dust. It turned not exactly to gold, but it worked.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that was interesting is, instead of relying on the politicians to ensure that the games could take place, he stepped in and directly to deal with heads of state and other decision makers, and not trust the so-called professionals to do the right thing. And it was actually quite remarkable. He persuaded the host country, the Republic of Korea, to let him handle this as if it were just an Olympic problem. And so the head of the Olympic movement would be meeting with the heads of the Olympic committees in both North and South Korea. And there was this fiction that was played out. It was underneath the appearance of it all. It was deadly serious to both the North and the South. And he played that very well. I think he was able to say to the South Koreans, look, let me handle this. There will never be any games in North Korea. It's just not going to happen. But what we need to do is have all of these so-called non-aligned nations, which were actually very much aligned, understand that the problem is not the IOC. The problem is their ally, the North Koreans. And eventually they'll understand that we, the IOC, have taken them seriously, and that the real problem is North Korea. It's not the Olympic movement at all, and we kept that open, the option for them to take part, all the way until the closing ceremony in Seoul. Never shut the door entirely, but I mean, it was a master play. I must say.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, one of the things he did, it sounds a trivial thing, but the sending out of invitations. Now, in the old days, that used to be done by the host city, and perforce, therefore, through the host nation. So after the First World War, the host city was Belgium and could exclude the aggressor nations. Same thing happened after the Second World War, where Germany and Japan were not allowed to take part in the 1948 Olympics. But under Samaranch, he suddenly realized that if an invitation came from the International Olympic Committee in Lausanne, it would be much harder for any nation to say, no, I'm not coming. And that was a masterstroke. And now, of course, every time there's a games, you have a big ceremony in the host city exactly a year before, where the president and various Olympic officials all stand in a great public ceremony where the first symbolic invitations are given. And you know, the symbolism and the way that it's perceived in the media and everything else is actually very, very important. And I think Samaranch was very smart in that, in positioning the IOC as an organization of influence. Under Kilanin, they tried and they'd done whatever they could to avert boycotts. And but it did somehow feel that they were whistling in the wind a little bit, and that what the set course of a government, be it Jimmy Carter in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, or Malcolm Fraser in Australia, they decided what they were going to do. And thankfully, the National Olympic Committees were strong in those countries and said, no, we're going to go. And they didn't take their national flag. They flew generally under the Olympic flag and had the Olympic anthem played for their medal ceremonies instead of their national anthem. But they went. They didn't attend opening and closing ceremonies, but they were still there and said the important thing is the sport. And this goes back to Olympic neutrality, something that you hear a lot about within the Olympic movement these days, this idea of being neutral and treating everybody who is a sportsman the same. And it's something that has caused problems over the last 130 years, but has also been essential to ensure that the Olympic Games continue.
That there's certainly a lot of strong opinions about those very topics. So it's a difficult situation for various IOC presidents and board members to navigate, for sure. You've talked a lot about sort of the more recent presidents, but I'm wondering if you can both speak for a few minutes about the part-time presidents, as you call them. You've mentioned in the past that there was an individual sort of behind the scenes who is maybe running things a little bit, and I'm wondering if you can speak about that.
Dick, do you want to start? Or
well, yeah, I'd say that Philip's given the history of the Michaelis, followed by de Coubertin, and then the evolution of de Coubertin to go on as president, and I think that is important because de Coubertin was an enormously energetic individual. I mean, he put that first Congress together almost single-handedly, and he must have had a perpetual writer's cramp because most of his stuff was done by hand, and he was a very young man at the time. He was in his, I think, 30s. Was he, Philip?
Yes, he was.
And dealing with heads of state and royalty. I mean, I think at the time of the formation of the IOC, there were only 2 countries in all of Europe that were not monarchies, and so that evolution has been important, and he had his hands all over that. And the others, I mean, the others were sort of, I don't know, it's probably a little denigrating, but more caretaker presidents. The Count and Siegfried Edstrom was, I think he was probably picked because the Swedes were overt neutrals during World War II, and he was very much a caretaker president in that respect. So it's you've got to cut the particular cloth that you've been given, and there are different styles of doing it. I mean, Callanan didn't like the United States. Instead of being on the first plane from Europe to Washington to talk to President Carter, he waited, I think, several weeks before even trying to open a dialogue. And by then it was Carter had jumped down the particular hole and was, it's not like when I deal with my kids sometimes, I say, when you've dug yourself into a hole, stop digging. And there was no getting that, no recapturing that, and so he had to live with that, and I mean the difference between the panache that Samaranch was able to display in the face of the retaliatory boycott in 1984. I mean, he got all of the non-aligned countries there. Not even all of the Warsaw Pact countries stayed away. I mean, that's how effective the message was. So it's there are horses for courses, and he was the right person at the right time. And as Philip said earlier, Callanan was not the right person at the right time.
What seems strange, though, is that you get this kind of circular thing where similar problems seem to crop up at various points. I mean, I think the Japanese Prime Minister Taro Aso called the Tokyo Olympics cursed because they'd had to hand back the 1940 games because of war, and you've had these kind of problems for almost every single president has to deal with the same kind of problem. And you had Bai Latour, who was president immediately after Coubertin in 1925. And he had to deal with the inherited problems that Coubertin had left him, resolving the question of amateur status, but also with a worsening international situation. The IOC gave the games to Tokyo because the officials were peace-loving, but in their country, the government was militaristic, had just invaded China, and eventually they had to hand them back. And then it went to Finland, and you get this sense that in a way they were kind of disconnected with the international situation, because even in 1940 the Finns had to hand the games back, and they sent a Christmas card showing a bombed out sports center, and this had been done by the invading Soviet forces, and this was their Christmas card, the organizing committee. And even then, Avery Brundage, who was by then climbing up the IOC ladder, he was involved with the organization of the first Pan American Games. And because United States had not yet entered the Second World War, the games were scheduled for 1942. And all of his noises, well, our games can still go ahead. And there were, and he wasn't alone in that kind of feeling. As Dick was alluding there to Siegfried Edström from Sweden, who took over when Bai Latour died. He was from neutral Sweden, and he actually did keep the game, the Olympic movement as it was going, but it was very, very difficult because a lot of the world, travel was almost impossible in Europe for a lot of countries because of the war. And so he just at least kept it going until 1945 when peace came. They had an executive board in London, and you look at the minutes for that, and it says, well, the first thing we've got to do is get everything back on track, get more members of the IOC back in, people that we can do business with from the world of sport, and also get the games back on track, because it's nearly 10 years since they last happened in Berlin. So, you've got similar. There's almost a little parallel in a way with Thomas Bach saying, we've got to keep the Olympic Games going in Tokyo. We can't just say cancel them, because that's 8 years and people, have been starved of Olympic sport. In this day and age, they might go elsewhere. They might go to other sports are available and still happening. Perhaps they'll forget about the Olympics if they don't happen, So I guess that was a problem back in the 1940s, that they hadn't happened for so long. To actually get them back on track. And you've got, the political problems that other presidents have faced with a greater or lesser degree. There was a breakaway movement in the 1960s. They had the Asian Games in Jakarta in Indonesia. They refused passports to the team from China, Taipei, as it's now known, and to Israel. And their president then set up breakaway games for the new emerging forces. So this was like a rebel, like an Olympic Games, a multi-sport event with political overtones, and they had to deal with that. And now we've seen the same with Russia starting to setting up friendship games after they were excluded from the Olympic movement as an entity after the invasion of Ukraine. So all these things are coming around in circles, appropriately, I suppose, with the Olympic rings, that things do move in circles. But it does seem to me that over the years you find similar problems causing obstacles for the practice of sport. And like the starting of wars, we as a human race don't seem to learn anything.
That's very interesting points you're making there, Philip. History does seem to run in circles quite regularly. So we've talked, or you all, both of you have talked quite a bit about history, and I'm wondering if we can pivot and talk about the future. There was just an election here a couple months ago, and Kirsty Coventry was elected the incoming president of the IOC. So I was wondering if you can share a little bit what happens during the transition period after an election before a new president takes office. What's going on during that time?
Well, I think the formal transfer of power is going to happen on June 23rd of this year. So, but since the election in March, she and Thomas have been, I'm sure they're getting her up to speed on all the issues. Here are the hot buttons. Here are the problem areas. Here's what you may want to think about doing if we're going to have some new members. Thomas's view was, look, I'm not going to saddle you with members that I've selected. We can look at the files and assess the needs and the skill sets that we're looking for and the people to match those. But these are people that are going to serve with you for your first term of 8 years. You've got to have a team that with which you're comfortable. So I think that's been a good interim period because Kirsty's been a member for 8 or 10 years now. Most of the work that she's done has been in the athlete stream, the athletes committee and the athletes commission. If you take a look at the financial statements of the IOC these days, you've got to have a huge grasp of what the business of the IOC is and how the funds are A, collected and B, distributed. And that is a much different situation than, when I was a younger member, I was doing the television negotiations personally as a member, which would not happen today. And same with the top program, the marketing. I was meeting with the CEOs of the multinational company to persuade them that this is a good investment, etc. Now that's all done by experts.
Interesting. You mentioned hot buttons, and I'm wondering if you can speak to what you foresee being the most significant challenges and opportunities over the next 5 or 10 years.
Well, certainly the political scene is fraught with difficulties, and I thought somebody put that to Kirsty and said, how are you going to deal with Xi? How are you going to deal with Putin? How are you going to deal with Trump? And she said, I've dealt with a lot of difficult men in my time. So, and I think most of them don't enjoy being offside. I mean, all of the stuff surrounding Russia is for Russian consumption. Nobody believes a word of what Putin is saying about Russia's being picked on unfairly and so on. And, the doping was deliberate, and he was responsible, identified as being personally responsible by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So he's got to keep the home fires under control and figure out a way back. And there's a lot of soft diplomacy going on around this to try and find a path back, but nobody's nibbling at the moment.
That's fair. Philip, do you have any thoughts on that subject?
Well, it was interesting that in Paris we did see some Russian athletes and we did see some Belarus athletes, and they had this special status. They weren't allowed to use their national anthem. They weren't allowed to use the national flag, and they were AIN, which I think stands for Athlètes International Neutral, or Neutral International Athletes. And they even had a special piece of music that they were going to play at medal ceremonies. So, they were accommodated in much the same way as when countries have been excluded from the Olympics before, the athletes have been allowed to participate under, say, an Olympic flag rather than their national flag, so that the athletes themselves haven't been punished. And this is an innovation over the last 40 odd years. Before that, the IOC wasn't anything like as flexible on those sort of matters. But Thomas Bach actually said something quite interesting at the IOC session in Costa Navarino a couple of days before the elections took place. He gave a press conference and he said that he thought that whoever the new president was would have a much less uncertain time. There was much more uncertainty in the world when he took over in 2013. Now, I wonder whether that is now the case with the conflicts that we've had. Well, we've had India and Pakistan at one another's throats, obviously the Middle East conflict as well, and the ongoing situation with Russia and Ukraine, to say nothing of many, many other conflicts in the world that don't get the publicity in the global media. So I wonder whether, this is difficult, and this is where this whole notion of Olympic neutrality, is put to a real test, because sometimes it almost feels like you're defending the indefensible to allow, say, games to go ahead in a country where human rights are not respected and so on and so forth. But you could look at any country and everybody has flaws. So unless you're totally neutral and say, are they doing the right thing for sport? The whole thing might fall apart. So it's just maintaining. I mean, it's clearly a very successful product. Everybody loves watching the Olympics. The crowds in Paris last year, I saw, virtually everywhere I went, and I got to as much as I could. The crowds were enthusiastic. Different countries coming together. Wonderful to see that whole idea of everybody coming together to watch the Olympics. And so they've got a brilliant product there, and lots of new sports as well to attract people to watch them in the same way. But, just to keep that going and make sure that nothing comes in to jeopardize it. And, we've had problems in the past, and, you do, to a certain extent, have to know your history a bit. And know that the Olympic Games, like anything else, are vulnerable to malevolent forces.
Yeah. And there's the other issue that I think Philip mentioned it a little bit earlier is dealing with the crisis of refugees and giving refugees some status at the Olympic Games, even though they're maybe alienated from their country, or their country's a failed state, or whatever it may be. Give them an opportunity to show that you're paying attention to what's going on in the world for everybody, and not just the haves, but also the have-nots.
Well, this was one of the great things that Thomas Bach did, wasn't it? I mean, yes, you could say that it's only affecting a few people. I mean, I remember in 2016 when the Olympic torch was taken to a refugee camp in Athens, and it was a little unseemly because the journalists was crowded around as if they were a film star, and the poor little kids who were there to watch nearly got crushed in the thing. But the idea that the refugees are recognized. Now, in fact, the idea of refugees in the Olympics is not a new concept. After the First World War, the Russian Revolution, there were overtures made to the IOC that Russian emigres might be allowed to take part in the Games, and a similar overture after the Second World War. And at that point, the IOC were not anything like as flexible as they are now. I mean, they had athletes from East Timor who were fundamentally, without a state at that point, because nobody had recognized their nation in 2000 in Sydney, and they marched under the Olympic flag. You had athletes from Bosnia-Herzegovina during the Balkan War who were allowed to take part in the Olympics again. And so certainly over the last 30 or so years, the IOC has become more flexible to problems of humanity. And certainly under Thomas Bach, he gets a lot of criticism for certain things, and rightly so. But on this particular issue, he has done a good thing, and I think this might be one of his lasting legacies: is helping to draw attention to the refugee crisis in the world through using the prism of sport, where you've got people taking part in what is arguably at any time the largest peacetime event. So it has elevated them and kept them in the public eye, so to speak, so that people, can't really forget about the refugees if you see them front and center during the Olympic parade or during the Olympic Games themselves competing.
Thank you for that. At this point, I would like to switch. We've gotten a few questions from people who registered for the program and from people in our audience. So I'd like to ask a couple of those with the time we have remaining. We had one question that made me smile. What is a typical day like for an IOC president? Is there a typical day?
It depends where you are. I think if you're in Lausanne running the shop, your day starts with a breakfast meeting, and you'd go through all kinds of meetings, visiting heads of state, visiting national Olympic committees, and so on, and dinner, a formal lunch, formal dinner. It's a kind of an 18-hour day of meetings, and then you've got 206 national Olympic committees, and the recent presidents have made an effort to try and find some way to visit every one of them during the presidential term. And so there's a ton of travel, a ton of appearances, interviews with the media, addressing the United Nations General Assembly. There's no typical day other than the typical day for a president is that it's filled.
And you're always on, aren't you? That's the thing. You're always on. You don't really have a moment to yourself. You scratch your head, and the world somewhere will have taken a photograph of it and put it out on social media. Sort of. So it's a bit like it's really rather like being a head of state, is that you're always on show, I would imagine. So it's quite a pressurized thing.
I imagine so. Not a job that I would want, for sure. We've had a couple questions in the chat come in. Is there a relationship between the IOC president and the Paralympics? Is the IOC president the head of the Paralympics? And how does the IOC and the IPC work together?
Well, they work together now very well, and one of the things that the IOC has done that is really cemented the future of the Paralympics is when we award the Olympic Games. Part of the deal is that 2 weeks after the closing ceremony, you host the Paralympics, winter and summer. But there are two separate federations, each with their own president. And one of the difficulties we had initially was it was a kind of a combative relationship. If the IOC had Visa as its credit card sponsor, the Paralympics would say, well, fine, we'll have MasterCard. And if we had Coca-Cola, they would take Pepsi-Cola. We finally said, the whole is larger than the sum of the parts. Let's do the deals, television and marketing and so on, as if we're one, even though they're two separate events. And that's been very successful, and almost all of the angst has gone out of the relationship. And we had a lot of work to do with the Paralympics to say, listen, Paralympians, look, you have a wonderful story to tell and to show the world. Don't waste energy picking away at the IOC and trying to have a wheelchair event in the middle of the Olympic Games. Have your own event, and you can tailor it the way you need to deal with the various types of and levels of disability. But we're all kind of in the same family one way or another of trying to do the best with what we have, and let's focus on that. And that's worked out pretty well in the last probably what 10 or 12 years, Philip, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of the things in Paris that was noticeable was if you walked up the Champs-Élysées, the great Arc de Triomphe had the Agitos, which is the Paralympic symbol on, and that was installed before the Olympics took place and was on display during the Olympic Games, which had never ever happened before. You'd always had a sort of changeover period that you'd have the night of the closing ceremony of the Olympics, and the following day the Olympic rings would mysteriously disappear to be replaced by the Paralympic symbol. But the French, the Paris organizers made a point of displaying the Paralympic logo on one of the most famous buildings through the duration of the Olympics to symbolize that these are both two sides of the same coin. We are all humans, we are all people. Therefore, our events are intertwined. And I thought that was a very powerful message that they sent out.
And one thing we've done is make the president of the International Paralympic Committee a member of the IOC as well, so that institutionally, you're in the middle of things.
That's fascinating. I really appreciate that, and it's good to know that there's a stronger relationship than there used to be, and that all signs seem like that's going to continue.
Well, in your country is a perfect example. You've changed the name of the U.S. Olympic Committee to the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and so it's all
exactly,
and a different part of the same family. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And our museum is the United States Olympic and Paralympic Museum. It's right there in the name. We had a comment come in the chat that was talking about opportunities for local residents in the host city during the games. If that's something that you think there'll be a trend towards increasing, more opportunity for local residents to view the games, to enjoy them, to appreciate them. Is that something that you see as a priority?
You want to start on that, Phil?
Well, I mean, already there are volunteer programs at every Olympics, and the local people are invited to take part in those. So, the volunteer program of every game seems to be vastly oversubscribed. If you read the figures, for 50,000 volunteers, they get 750,000 people wanting to be a volunteer. So they have to set up other programs as well for those who aren't Olympic volunteers to be city volunteers, and that seems to have come over the last few years. Certainly, there's always a problem over tickets and so on and so forth. I know there were in London that they had difficulties with people accessing tickets, and the annoying thing was if you went to a venue somewhere where there were palpably empty seats, and yet you went to the ticket office and the computer says no. No, it shows you that they're full. So that was frustrating for some people. But, they do try and make a lot of the tickets affordable. It depends on what your definition of affordable is. But as an official once said to me, if you make stuff too cheap, people don't think it has any value. And therefore, if it happens to be raining or whatever, they won't bother to come. Whereas if they've made an investment to buy the ticket, then there's more sort of onus. We paid so much for this particular ticket, we've got to make use of it. So there is a difficulty. I see somebody was talking about digital tickets. As somebody who is a technophobe and a journalist, in Paris we had to have special apps on our phone, and that caused a lot of angst, I can tell you, trying to work that out. Quite apart from the fact that I quite like to keep the tickets from the Olympics because they're always designed beautifully, and an object you can keep with your programs, your photographs, and everything else. And don't disregard the memorabilia, because having a program or whatever. Yes, I'm a geek and I like all that stuff, but a lot of other people do too. And you like to have something to remember your Olympics by. And over the years you get them out of a chest or whatever. and the memories that you have. I think after the Los Angeles Olympics, they said the games are over, now the memories begin. And the memories are part of the legacy of an Olympics.
You have a lot of fans in the comments right now, Philip. I think we have a lot of fellow geeks, and I count myself among them for sure. So, well, we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm wondering if each of you can take a moment to just share maybe a final thought. What do you wish to see from the IOC president going forward? What would be your goal or your wish for the coming days?
Well, I certainly, as a member, I would hope that Kirsty, does one of the things that leaders should do and often don't, and that's listen. And because there are lots of good ideas out there, and they deserve to be heard and considered, maybe not adopted, but so I think that will be something that she will do, and certainly in organizations where there are female leaders, one of the reasons they're there is because they do listen, and that's really important.
As a journalist, I'd like to see the IOC president being a little bit more accessible in a slightly more flexible way than has been the case over the years, because you have a set piece press conference and often a journalist only gets to ask one question. There's no real dialogue. I understand that there are practical and logistical difficulties, but I'd like to see, as many people have said, many of the candidates said that the press are the important advocate in helping to promote the Olympic Games, or the media, I should say, taking it as a wider thing. I'd just like to see them take more, observe that in reality rather than just in fine words.
I think the Olympic leaders have a burden of persuasion. I mean, the onus is on the IOC to put forward its view on whatever the issues may be, and it's not for the media to have to figure all that out. They should hear it and they comment on it. But so you gotta know your own business, both the hard sides and the soft sides of it.
I agree with that. Well, thank you both so much, Richard and Philip. This has been really a wonderful conversation. I know that I've learned a lot and really enjoyed it. There are a lot of questions in the chat in the comments that we didn't get to, but I did want to let everyone know that the program has been recorded and will be available online here very soon. I also would like to invite everyone to join us for our next Games History Hour. It will be in September, and we'll be focusing on Games history at that point. I invite you to follow both the United States Olympic and Paralympic Museum and the International Society of Olympic Historians on social media for more information. So thank you to all for joining us today. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Richard, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Congratulations on a great idea and getting it up and going. Philip and I sort of thought we were kind of the beta version of something that will get catch on and become even more popular.
Well,
I think this has been great.
Anything that can promote the Olympic movement and its history is something that the International Society of Olympic Historians are very keen to do. So we're kind of, we're keen to do as much as we can to get new people interested, because it's such a great story. So thank you for having us today.
It's been our pleasure. All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye-bye.